I'd like to start, as we try and start at all of these events, with the local historian or librarian, someone who has helped us ground ourselves in the community and get a feel for the history and the working life of the community. And definitely Lynn has been that person. So please, Lynn Thornton, welcome. And I'll let you start us off.
Thank you very much. Nice to see all your smiling faces out there. I'm going to tell a slightly different story about my life. It's the first year I taught in the district. I graduated from Oswego in June of 1964. So I started in DeFerriet in September of that same year. What was interesting about that was the fact that Herring School closed over the summer. And both of the schools, DeFerriet and Herrings, were combination classes. One teacher for first and second, one for third and fourth, one for fifth and sixth, and a kindergarten class teacher. When they closed the Herring School, they acted like those kids fell off the face of the earth. They didn't order any supplies for them, but they told them all to go to the DeFerriet School. So I was hired over the summer by, I had an interview with Don Hausner. Some of the names that I kick out, some of you will know, some of you will not know. But Don Hausner interviewed me and told me I was going to be second grade teacher, which was fine because I had student taught in kindergarten and first grade, so it was a natural progression. So I get down there a couple days before everything was supposed to start, and somebody pointed out my room. There were two other teachers there. The first grade teacher was Mary Emerson from Watertown. She'd been first and second. The third grade teacher was Ellen Eckelman, Dr. Eckelman's first wife, and she had been third and fourth. And Arlene LaRue, who had been fifth and sixth. So the three of them were there, and they showed me my room, and they said, this used to be the art room, and it's all yours now. So I went in, and there were desks, and there was a big desk for me, and I opened the top drawer. There's a box of stars, and there are two red pencils, and there isn't anything else anywhere in the room. Nothing. So I kind of went out and asked Mary Emerson, the first grade teacher, I said, what happened to all the supplies? And she said, geez, I didn't order them. And I said, well, do you have anything I could use? And she said, well, I mostly used first grade materials. I have a couple of books, and I have some paper I can let you have. And I said, well, that would be nice. That would be helpful. I ended up spending a lot of time in the attic with Mr. Bridge, who was the custodian, and looking through boxes up there. And we found some old readers that had the boys in knickers. And I was able to round up enough. I mean, I knew everybody wouldn't be in the same book. So I had to find a couple of different levels and brought them down. And that really was about all we had. My principal, who I didn't get to meet until after the first of the year, had had 3 heart attacks over the summer. Bernard Dwyer was his name. He had 3 heart attacks over the summer, and he was nowhere around. So I asked the 3 teachers that were there, I said, what do I do? And one of them said, well, you're going to have to requisition everything you're going to need. I was very, very lucky. I had had a master teacher in my kindergarten job or position who had Altmar Parish, Williamstown, had just added a new addition, and it included a new kindergarten. And she had to furnish it from the ground up. Now, she'd been teaching for probably 25 years. She knew what she needed, but she gave me the same job. She said, this is what I had to do. I had to get everything from every sheet of paper I would need to pencil sharpeners to everything else. And she said, I want to see what kind of a job you can do given the catalogs and some of the forms. And she made me do that as a little additional task to, but yeah, I'm so glad she did. So I had about 15 children come, and I was right. They weren't all in the same book. They weren't all on the same page at all. But we, settled in and got some things done. I remember one thing very, very vividly was it was before Thanksgiving, and we had spent the day writing the Thanksgiving story on all the blackboards around the room. And I was sitting there making a copy of it because I couldn't do that while the kids were there because they were just too active. So it was probably about 5 o'clock. I'm still sitting there copying some of this. And Paul Duffner, who was the superintendent of schools at that time, came in. And he said, what are you up to? And I told him. Of course, I'd had him as a principal when I was a kid. And I was still a little nervous about that. But he was very, very nice, and I told him what I was working on and things like that. He said, well, sounds good. So, I proceeded to do what I did. One thing that we had lots of was art paper, because the Herrings Mill, see, the ferry was a mill town, and they were all interconnected. But the Herrings Mill they produced what they called craft paper. But it was all different colors. They had all different kinds of dye lots that they would experiment with, and some of it was no good at all, and some of it was very, very good. But the stuff that really wasn't up to their standards, they let the dads take home. And a lot of fathers would just bring in armloads of colored paper, and we would just sort it. We had a room down cellar that we would just sort it onto shelves, and you were welcome to use whatever you wanted. That was really great because we could do a lot of things with cut paper and paste. We did a lot of things like that. Some of the teachers that started off with me were a little better off than I was because they taught before. Actually had their own classroom. I was second grade. The fourth grade teacher was Janice Beining, and she lived in Carthage. And the sixth grade teacher was Donna Waltz, who taught in the district forever and ever. And she was just wonderful. But we carpooled, too. That was just one of those things you needed to do back then. And I had a little bitty Volkswagen, and we all just kind of stuffed ourselves in it and got to work. But it had a beautiful playground. If you know the building in DeFerrier, it's now an apartment building, and it's built on a triangle as you enter the village. And there was a beautiful big playground, and we had a lot of fun on that. Halfway through the year, or a little more than that maybe, I realized I was expecting a baby. And those were kind of tricky days because some schools let you teach when you were visibly pregnant and some schools did not. And when it came to spring break, I knew I had to, Mr. Dwyer was back by then, and I knew I was going to have to talk to him because I wasn't going to be able to hide this after spring break. A couple of weeks was going to, So I went in and I told him, my situation. And I said, I want to know how long I can teach. He said, how long do you want to teach? I said, well, I want to finish the year. But I said, that's going to bring me to, because Christopher was due in August. He wasn't born till September, but he was due in August. And Mr. Dwyer looked at me and he said, well, that girl on Lawrence Welk, she sang right up until the end. He says, I don't see why you can't do the same thing. So I did. Some other interesting things that happened, though. We took the children who were getting a free lunch, or I don't know exactly what the designation was because I never really had to divide them up. Certain kids went to the kindergarten room and had their lunch, and the rest of them got on a bus and went to Great Bend. But about January, possibly, somebody from Pine Camp hit the bridge over the Black River by taking a truck much, much too big over the bridge and knocked part of it off the foundation. So you couldn't go across the bridge, especially not with a school bus. we had to go all the way through Pine Camp and back out. I think we went via Munn's Corners and then back out to Great Bend. And by the time you did that and had lunch for the kids and loaded them back up and brought them back, you'd lost a good hour of instructional time, not just the time that you were, supposed to be eating. So there were a lot of difficulties that year, but it was wonderful. And after I had the children, I substituted for a while, and then, I didn't even look over to see if there were any flags. Okay. And so after I substituted for a while, I finally got to the point where I realized that our family was running much better if I had a long-term sub position and they knew where Mom was going to be the next day. So that's when I went back to the school and said, okay, I'm ready to come back. So they gave me a 6th grade at West Carthage for 1 year, and then they moved me back to the Farragut until it closed. And do you remember what year was that, Marion? 78. Okay. Because I was looking up, I was trying to find that, but I was looking up when Pine Camp became Fort Drum, because I knew it was still Pine Camp when I started down there. And that was 74. So that it became Fort Drum. So, no, it went, Camp Drum, I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah, okay. Then Fort Drum. Anybody remember Spence and Grace Western? No? They were a gym teacher and music teacher that taught together. They were the cutest little couple, they really were. They were down there. And I'm just trying to think if there was anything else that I wanted to include. I wanted a reading center, so I brought in a bridge table from home and put a big tablecloth over it so you could sit under it if you wanted to read a book underneath it or sit in a chair at it. And when I went back 10 years later, that was still there. And we had to cut stencils too. If you were doing an original ditto sheet, original paper, otherwise dittos were just coming out, the ditto books, and those machines jammed all the time. Yep, and Mrs. Eckelman was our go-to person for that. She always fixed them. Well, her husband was a doctor. What do you want? So I think that really... Yep.
When did you get involved in local history?
When I was in 4th grade in West Carthage, New York State went to a program. I'm popping my peas, aren't I? New York State went to a program where they wanted to teach research skills through local history on the 4th grade level. So I helped design the curriculum with the local BOCES to do that. There were there was a girl from Watertown, there were 2 from Constableville. And we designed the local curriculum and published something for people to go by. And then we presented at the state level too. But that really kicked off my interest. I mean, I was born in Carthage, and there was a lot I didn't know. And I really found out a lot. And it was great. Any questions?
So, we're not being that strict about the time. I was supposed to say that before you got started, and I forgot. So, welcome. We're telling stories tonight about work life in this neck of the woods. And next up is Terry Hegel. Did I say your name right? Hegel. Terry Hegel, come on up.
Anytime? Anytime. Hi, my name's Terry Allen Hegel, and I live in West Carthage. And my work story is about my brief career on radio back in 1981. At the time, I was enjoying a career sabbatical. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, it's what we college grads call unemployment. My wife, Becky, was teaching at a local high school, and I was driving her crazy with my rants about not being able to find a job. And her idea was to think outside the box, so I did. While typing up application letters and resumes on my Smith Corona typewriter, I kept the radio on to catch some tunes. This led to a rather crazy idea. Maybe I could work at a radio station. I mean, how hard can it be? At the time, there were 4 stations in Watertown. All 4 got a letter and resume. 3 said no real quick, and 1 said, when could you start? So after a very brief interview with the station manager, I was offered a job at WATN 1240 AM on your dial. It's located in Wells Avenue in Watertown. It has a broadcast signal during the day of 1,000 watts. And at night, they crank it down to 250 watts. It's barely enough to cover the city of Watertown. The missus was glad I got a job, but she asked me, well, what do you know about radio? Well, I know enough to turn it on and find the station on the dial. But I didn't know really anything. But I guess, they were going to train me. I was excited about finally being able to earn a paycheck again. I was also real nervous about making a fool of myself. It's a good thing this is not TV because I've been told I have a face for radio. The first night rolls around, and I was told to report to the station at 11:30 p.m. one Friday night. And I rang the front doorbell, and the station engineer lets me in. I filled out a real quickie form, and this was sent to the FCC in in Washington. And it's my license. Essentially, what they gave me was a learner's permit to be on the radio. So I had a grand total of 15 minutes worth of training. And you're sitting there, and you've got all this equipment in front of you, and all these lights, and everything is blinking, and, I'm pretty much a Luddite. I had no clue what I was doing. But the main thing is, you flip the switch, the red light comes on, and if the red light's on, then you have to say something. Because radio is radio, and it's not TV. So if you're not saying anything, you have nothing but static going out. So I didn't want static. Okay. So at midnight, the station ran 5 minutes of news from the Mutual Broadcasting Network. And after that, I flipped the red switch and the light was on, and I was live. And the first thing I did on the radio was a quickie weather report and a current temperature. Then the station ran a rebroadcast of the best of the Larry King Show. Okay, he was on radio, and that ran for a few hours. Some very long hours. Your mind basically goes numb listening to talk radio at 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it's like Sominex. It's just awful. The engineer had an old army blanket, and the station had this old beat-up couch. He was going to sleep at the station, and he told me to wake him up if I got into any deep trouble. That was my backup. During the breaks, scheduled breaks in the Larry King Show, I would do weather updates, trying to sound knowledgeable. Now, mainly what we did was open the back door and look up. If you couldn't see stars, it was cloudy. If you saw stars, it was clear. We had a big flashlight. We shined it at the thermometer in the back, and we would find out what the temperature was. And we'd go back in and tell everybody, well, it's a clear night in Watertown, and the temperature is 35 degrees. Nobody was going to check at 3 o'clock in the morning. So the pre-recorded show ends, and I finally get to spin some tunes. Now, today's radio station is a high-tech wonder. It's all computer-driven. Am I right? Yeah. All right, back in 81, I had 2 turntables to spin records on my left. To my right, I had a combo of 8-track machines that we would put in these cartridges to run our 30-second commercials. We also had cassette tapes as well. I should pause and let you folks with smartphones Google those ancient devices so you would know what I'm referring to. So the first tune I played was Hall & Oates' Kiss on My List. Song still makes me smile every time I hear it on the radio. On Sunday mornings, I spun American Top 40 with Casey Kasem. That came via UPS each week in a 4-album set. And it had huge gaps in it. And they would run 3 or 4 of the tunes, and then it would pause, and then you could run 2 or 3 minutes worth of commercials, and then you hit it back up with American Top 40, boom, and you would go back into it. The thing ran for 4 hours. There's a couple of cool things that happened when I was on the air. The first, phone rings one morning, and it's probably about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. This guy calls up, and he says he really likes the tunes that I'm playing. And I'm thinking to myself, great, well, maybe I got a fan club growing here. And the gentleman goes on to tell me that his gals really like the music as well. Okay, now I'm really smiling. Now I got a female fan club. Then he says all the tails are wagging. Turns out the guy was a farmer, and he was doing the early morning milking. And it appears my choice of tunes was a hit for the bovine set. So just imagine all these little tails just going back and forth. The second thing that happened stands out. It was a cloudy, rainy night. It's probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Phone rings again. I got another listener, and he's up late, and I figured, well, he's probably going to request a song. So the guy asked me, what station was this? And I tell him it's 12:40 a.m. And he asked, well, where are you? And I say, Watertown. And he asked me, well, where's Watertown? I tell him upstate New York. Now I'm curious. At 250 watts, I figured he had to be in Watertown because 250 watts barely covered Watertown. So I ask him, well, where are you? And he replies, Detroit. I said, what? And he goes, Detroit, Michigan. He's on the 8th floor of his apartment building. He's a late night guy. And he just likes to spin the dial, pick up various radio stations. So he's spinning the dial and he hears me, and he likes the music that I'm playing. And then I ask him, well, at 250 watts, how in the blazes are you picking me up in Detroit, Michigan? And then the guy goes on to explain the concept of skip. If it's completely cloudy from Watertown to Detroit, the radio signals are bouncing. And they bounced all the way to Detroit. And I just thought that was cool. Okay, 250 watts, I'm broadcasting in Detroit. I hit the big time. Okay. Anyway, lastly, so one night, station engineer comes back from a night of cruising the local watering holes in Watertown. I should mention, at the time, I was 28 years old. I was the oldest person in the station. Station manager was 26. I was the only one there with a master's degree. All these guys were going to school or doing something part-time, and they're all single, and Watertown had a few establishments that would close probably 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And they would come back to the radio station, and their cars are parked a little funny, okay? And one of the rules that we had in the radio station is you had to leave the coffee pot on and make sure the blanket was ready on the couch, so the guys would come in and crash before they went home. So the station engineer comes in, and he crashes and sleeps for a while, and it's probably about 4 o'clock in the morning that guy gets up. We didn't have a refrigerator. We just had boxes of pizza with slices of old pizza in there. So the guy's got some coffee and some 3-day old pizza. And he comes into the control room, and we just start to chit-chat. And we had another canned program going on, so we had lots of time to talk. And he told me one thing that still sticks with me today. Okay. At sea level, the speed of sound is roughly 700 miles per hour. Okay? So, you're familiar with skip, and it's bouncing around, but radio waves also go up, and they're going through the atmosphere. And he goes, your voice is now part of the great space collective noise out there. So I want you to think about this. This was in 1981. 27 years times 365 days times 700 miles per hour, according to my calculator, is roughly 8.5 billion miles into space. Never forgot that piece of trivia. And every now and then I think about it. A couple thousand years from now, there might be E.T. sitting at some control booth someplace, and he's searching the dial, trying to find intelligent life in the universe. And the first thing he may hear is me. And I think that's cool. And that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. That was great. So, no matter what radio station you work at, the stories are the same. We get those kind of calls and the late night. And actually, we still spin records, CDs, and play digital MP3s and that sort of thing. We do it all because we have live hosted music shows at North Country Public Radio still. But yeah, you could have been up at our station. A lot of that rang very familiar stories. In the early days of radio, when everything was AM, before FM kind of swept the industry in the 60s, AM signal, which is line of sight, versus FM, which, AM follows terrain, whereas FM is line of sight, like your cell phone. So AM signals, especially at night, will travel very far, because they'll just follow any terrain. You call it skip or terrain, but they'll follow it. So I often nowadays I tune in the Yankees games out of New York City at night. I can get them in my car because I'm a Yankees fan. Don't tell me if you're not a Yankees fan. I don't want to know. She's a Boston fan. Anyway, so but FM signal, and this is part of the reason we have over 30 transmitters for our station, which get us to Glens Falls and Burlington area, over to Tug Hill, and everything in between, is because FM signal is line of sight. And so we have to broadcast to mountaintops and leapfrog from mountaintop to mountaintop, and then broadcast down into all the little villages of the Adirondacks, whether it's Long Lake or Newcomb or whatever. We have a transmitter on the top of a nearby mountain to reach the people in those communities. So, but yeah, it was fun hearing your radio stories. I loved it. What did you do after you had your fabulous year or so in radio?
I worked for a company called Employment Training Resources, and we did workshops in the area for long-term unemployed, resume writing, interview technique, helping them go out into the community and just try and find a job. The mechanics of helping them get a job. Mm-hmm. And did that for about a year or so, and then spent 3 years playing Mr. Mom at home.
Good for you.
So.
Good for you. That's great. That's good for you. Oh.
Yeah. Jumped back into the job market in 1988, working at Sears, hustling credit cards. I was one of the guys who used to stand out in front of the mall and try and sign you up for a Sears card or a Discover card. And that was fun. When I was doing that in 1990, I answered an ad and wound up becoming an adjunct instructor at Jefferson Community College. And long story short, I retired from Jefferson in December of 2014.
And what did you teach there?
For 10 years, I taught business courses. There was, I'm trying to remember, 8 different business courses I taught, from intro up to human resource management, organizational behavior. You want another story?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm working at Sears, and Sears is not what you call a career position. You're hustling credit cards, and you get paid a commission, and it's dumb. It was just a dumb job. I learned an awful lot about human psychology. We had this thing, where we had this speech we had to tell them when we saw somebody come walking down the mall. We had to get in their face and basically say, "Hello there, would you like to have a Sears credit card?" And of course they would look at you like you had the plague and run away. Well, right across from the entrance of Sears was Dr. Pet's. So I got to know the manager of Dr. Pet's. And I looked at him and I said, if we're going to do this, and we have to give him some sort of trinket, that there's got to be something that we can give people for filling out the credit card. So for women, it was dishes. For guys, it was flashlights. Guys like a tech type thing. And I just put the script aside, and I went over and looked at Deb, the manager of Dr. Pet's, and said, "Can I have a puppy?" And I would stand behind my desk holding a puppy. And Mom's coming up with the kids, and all of a sudden you hear this, "Mom, he's got a puppy." And next thing you know, the kids are playing with the puppy, and Mom's sitting down filling out a credit card application. Long story short, I had 11,000 people fill out credit card applications in 4.5 years.
I might have been one of them. I'm a sucker for a puppy. Absolute sucker for a puppy. So, okay, let's move along now to Matt Carney. Welcome Matt up here.
Good evening. I wish I had a puppy in my arms right now, but I don't. So a little bit about me. I'm retired from 36 years in education, and nearly 30 of them was at Carthage High School and middle school, most at the high school. I guess no story of a long career, particularly a career in one place, is complete without figuring out how I got there. And how I got there was that we wanted to get back into the area. My wife and I met in the Peace Corps, and then we worked at Hofstra University on Long Island, and we found ourselves coming up every weekend back to the North Country because I grew up in the eastern Adirondacks. And finally we just said, let's get back to the North Country. So we drew a line from Saratoga County to Oswego County and said we're going to go somewhere in that sector. We love snow, we love the woods, we love the mountains, and we really wanted to have quite a bit of land and animals. And right away I got an interview at Carthage, which I'd never heard of before, and came up here, met with the superintendent, and had a wonderful interview. And I heard for the very first time, I don't know where I'd been living, but I heard for the very first time about Fort Drum. And it was a very dynamic time because it was just becoming Fort Drum. It had been Camp Drum. So things were very dynamic at that time. We were very excited about the specter of new students and new families coming into the area, what kind of an effect that would have on the school, what kind of an effect that would have on the community. And I just really wanted to get on board with that. So I immediately said yes. We bought a house up in Natural Bridge in the town of Diana with a lot of land. And I can recall being out there, like one of the very first days we moved into the house, and 2 people rode by on horseback, 2 women, and said, what's your story? Why are you here? The Coons used to live in this house. And I said, yeah, they moved south. And we bought the house, and well, where are you working? I'm working at Carthage Central School District. Well, you'd have thought that I was the superintendent of schools because they were so upset that the Natural Bridge School had just closed, and they held me directly responsible for that. And a long discussion ensued, and I hadn't even been approved by the board at this point. I had jumped the gun and bought the house before that occurred. But we became friends over the years, and and we've loved living in the area and being part of really a tremendous change in the community and in the school. I really wanted to live in a school district that had some challenges, and Carthage provided that. You know, very soon after starting the job, we had a huge influx of families and students and people of different ethnic backgrounds, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And that provided opportunity, and it also provided challenge. And the challenge was to make those families feel comfortable here, because as strange as it was for people in the North Country maybe to be welcoming people from all over the United States and sometimes the world, it was difficult for them because we have a very unique culture here in the North Country. We have unique weather. I love snow, but not everyone does. I love woods and a scarcity of development. Not everybody does. And so the very first thing we had to do in the counseling department, because I was a school counselor for 30 years, is make sure that families felt welcome when they came to the school district. Students often came with a lot of baggage that you and I would have if we moved in the middle of our high school career. They'd come leaving boyfriends and girlfriends behind. They'd come leaving athletic teams behind that they were very invested in. They'd come leaving theater, music, you name it, social clubs behind, and it was very difficult for them. And a lot of times they resented the fact that they were here in Carthage. It was the first time they'd moved as a teenager, and who were they going to blame? They were either going to blame their parents, or they blamed us for being here to welcome them, basically. So a lot of those early transitions were difficult, and students really struggled with making that transition. As a former Peace Corps volunteer, I felt like I was uniquely able to help cope with that, because I'd lived many years overseas and 3 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tonga, and I knew what it was like to leave loved ones behind. I knew the pain that could cause. And I knew what it was like to go into a new culture. Coming to Carthage isn't like going to a foreign country, but it certainly has its own unique culture. It helped me to help students make that transition. It helped me to work with parents to make that transition. A lot of parents didn't like our weather. A lot of parents were bored at first. They didn't like the fact that there wasn't a mall on every corner, or there wasn't a movie theater around the corner. And it took some adjustment for that. But over the years, I learned that by the time students usually left us, they loved us. They loved our community. They loved our students. They loved our school. And they were just as sad, and sometimes even more sad, about leaving us than they were when they came. And the realization of that really helped me to welcome new students into the district, because I was confident that most of them, not all of them, but most of them would love us before they left us. Over the years, I also learned that the students coming from Fort Drum had a lot of different needs. They wanted to go to many different colleges and schools, and they had different aspirations than some of our local students. It was much more diverse. They wanted to go to such and such college in Michigan or Minnesota, which we'd never dealt with before. And in those days, you couldn't get on the internet and find out about that school. In fact, I can recall administration even being mad when we made too many long-distance calls at the time. So it was difficult to make those adjustments in the guidance department and prepare those students to go to the schools that they wanted. We certainly worked hard at that and made it happen, and as a result, a lot of our local students began to look at colleges and careers outside of what they had in the past. Certainly there were issues with race, and I found that that wasn't there was no seamless or easy fix to that. It took time, and certainly a lot of things helped with that. We had an excellent teaching staff. As students became integrated into the school and joined teams and arts activities, They became more and more comfortable with each other, and I'm happy to say that by the end of my career, I think that that really wasn't a very big issue in our school, and that's certainly a credit to our community and to all the people in our school district. Another thing that was a huge problem was the fact that New York State has very unique graduation requirements, and they're always changing. There's always a Regents Action Plan, or this plan, or that plan. And of course, you know, at Carthage we work very hard seeing that our students are prepared to meet those graduation requirements and pass those state tests. But there's also tests that students have to pass to graduate when they enter our school district as an 11th grader from Alabama or Texas or Oregon or wherever. And for some students that are really strong students, that's not usually a big issue. But for students coming from maybe a challenged educational background, sometimes it was next to impossible to get them to meet those graduation requirements. And you know, that caused for some, you know, we had to do an awful lot of work to help prepare those students for that. We were usually successful, not always, but it was a big shock to families when they'd come in and say, well, my student was on track to graduate in June of 2089, and now you're saying they're not going to graduate till June of 2090. So that was something we had to deal with quite a bit. Really throughout my career. That really never changes, because when students come from other districts or other states, they have a background that maybe doesn't quite match up with ours, or they come in mid-year and they'd be learning the first half of American history while our students were learning another part of American history, and they'd have to repeat it. So there were a lot of issues that we had to work through with parents, but you know, as a guidance counselor and as a coach, a longtime coach, I really enjoyed those challenges, and I really feel that we as a district and as a community have been successful in integrating the folks from Fort Drum in a meaningful way, and not only have we given them a safe place to land here in Carthage, they've enriched our lives as well. So I guess Fort Drum played a major role in my career.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt. Careful here. Yeah, when I moved up here in 1971 from Manhattan, my friends had a pool going. They thought I'd last maybe, you know, I moved from Broadway in Manhattan to the Maple Ridge Road in Old DeKalb, and my friends thought, she'll last a month, 3 months maybe. I don't think anyone even gave me a year. But the real culture shock for me was moving from Manhattan, which is an extremely multicultural world, to the North Country, which at that time, particularly St. Lawrence County, was 99% white. That was the biggest culture shock for me, actually, moving here from the city. Okay, so we have a lot of educators telling stories tonight, and it brings to mind the fact that when Amy and I were starting to gather photographs, one of the things we really wanted to pay attention to was women's work, because traditionally a lot of public education, the people who taught in schools were women, especially in the one-room schoolhouses. Not always, but women definitely had a real toehold professionally in teaching. But otherwise, women's work was kind of hidden in the 19th century and into much of the early part of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century. So we paid really close attention to making sure we collected photographs of women, whether it was feeding chickens in the front yard, hanging laundry on a line, or I was just wandering around earlier to look at the pictures that Amy and Claire put up here. There's Rietta Taylor pumping gas. There are all the women who worked at Parker's Laundry, and the women at work at the Carthage Republican Tribune. Is that the name of your paper? Yeah, Carthage Republican. In the shop there. So, I mean, one of the things we felt in collecting the content for North Country at Work was that we had to be very attentive. We couldn't simply let slip by us, things that maybe in an earlier time no one would pay attention to. That work is, all forms of work were valid, and particularly when women were involved in early years, their work could easily be neglected, and we wanted to be sure they're included. So I just thought of that because we have so many educators talking tonight. And you're like an honorary gal tonight, I guess, Anyway, Mary Ann is up next. How do you pronounce your last name, Mary Ann? Margray. Mary Ann Margray, also an educator, right? All right. Welcome.
Thank you. I've been very fortunate as an educator to teach for 41 years at a job that I have absolutely loved my entire life. And I've been in the same building for those 41 years. And I can say that every single day that I go to work, I look forward to it, because no 2 days in my life have ever been the same. It didn't matter if I was in the classroom or now that I'm serving as principal in the school. And it's interesting that Lynn went before me, because I began as a simple fourth grade teacher. And I was fortunate enough to be a student teacher in Lynn's room the very last year that DeFeria Elementary was open. So she was closing and had 13 students in her class. And I thought, wow, she's got such a range. So I know when she talks about the different levels of student ability, she really has that great level of student ability. We had students reading at a first grade level all the way up to a fifth grade level in a fourth grade classroom. So I thought I knew everything. So when this job opening came along at Augustinian Academy and I applied, I thought, I know everything. I worked with one of the best fourth grade teachers there was. So how hard can this be? Well, I went into a classroom of 29. I shared that with Amy and thought, how the heck do you do 29 kids at one time? And as she said, she found out, sister tells you, you just figure out how to do that. And you do. But I also found out that fourth graders are not the same. That fourth graders in September are very different from fourth graders in May and June. So my expectations for those poor guys that first year I taught were so high that I should have driven them right out of my classroom. As it is, when I think back, students are always saying, are we your favorite class? We're your best, aren't you? We're the favorite. You're always going to remember us. I have to say, I always go back to that first year, those 29 kids, because coming in as somebody who thought they knew exactly what they were doing, and then having them kind of put me in my place, they were the best class to have to start with, because your first class either makes you or breaks you as a teacher, and they definitely made my life easier because they made it better for me. Everything I said, they hung on all my words. They looked forward to everything that we had to do, and they were just excited. I tell students now about back those first days, because technology didn't exist. There was no iPhones, there were no cell phones, there was no Xerox machine. We had a tape recorder in our classroom, we had a record player, we had a movie projector that went reel-to-reel tapes. And if the tape broke in the middle of your movie, well, just had to find something for the kids to do until you could get it back on track. And mimeographs. The mimeograph machine was how we had copies of everything. So if you weren't well prepared, your copies were wet when you brought them down to the kids, and their fingers were all blue when they were all finished playing with them. But I still fond memories of that first year of class, because they made it easy to be a teacher. They made it easy to come in, and they made it easy to enjoy the career that I had chosen for myself. When I started that first year, it would have been enough just to be a teacher in the classroom, but Sister Bernadette came down and said, we really don't have a cheerleading coach. So would you be a cheerleading coach? And I said, oh, sure. I was never a cheerleader. So it's very hard to be a cheerleading coach when you don't even know how to cheer yourself. So I became the student, and they became my teachers, and we did a great job together. When cheerleading season ended, those same 7th and 8th graders decided I would make a great basketball coach. So I coached 7th and 8th grade basketball, and I think that's where I grew to love middle school students, because they were self-directed, self-motivated, they were great sports on the court, and they were wonderful role models for all the other students in the class. And they loved to hang out when school ended. The kids were just loved being together, so we'd end practice at 5 o'clock. And when I finished picking up the gym, I could still hear voices in the locker room at 5:30, 5:45, 6 o'clock. Parents weren't worried because they knew they were probably still at school and having a good time. So they hung out. So it just seemed fitting that after 5 years in 4th grade, my principal by then was Sister John Mary. And she came to me and she decided that I should teach 7th and 8th grade because they needed a math and science person, and I had both of those in my degree. So if I hadn't had those cheerleaders and basketball players, I would have said no, because I was never going to teach junior high or high school. And I think I had a high school math teacher, Mrs. Flanagan, who always told me I'd be back to teach high school. And she must have known something I didn't know back in those days, because I said yes and found that junior high is where I belong. That was my niche, and that's where I was driven to be. And so I spent 35 of my teaching years teaching 7th and 8th grade math. And I loved sharing that love of math with everybody. I remember I had a student, and when she came to me as a 7th grader, she's like, "Don't waste your time with me. I can't do math. I don't like math. People tell me I can't do math." And by the time she ended in 8th grade, she was one of my best math students. She left with such confidence that she knew that she could do anything that was put in front of her. And the interesting thing about all of those kids was when they get it. And today, with math changes that are going on, there are students who don't get it. You see it in their eyes. You know the minute that they understand what you said, and now they truly believe themselves that they know how to do math and that it's not something that they can't do. So after 35 years of being in the classroom and knowing that's what I was called to be, this was supposed to be my first year of retirement. I finished as a math teacher. I was ending at the end of 40 years, and that didn't work because we had a need for a principal. So my, I think, next role and last role at Augustinian is to serve as their principal. And I've got to say, it's just as exciting. I still miss being in the classroom full time, but I found a way to do that. But those faces of those little guys, I forgot what it was like to be with preschoolers and kindergartners and first graders and that. And their little faces when they come in and they're smiling in the morning, or they're going by at the end of the day and they're like, "I got a 4 today," because that means they had a great day, and all they want is a high five or to tell them they did a great job. So they stop at my door and have to just tell me the good news, and sometimes the not so good news, but that was it. Over the course of my years at Augustinian, in those 40 years, I've seen a lot of students come and go. I've been fortunate enough to actually co-teach with students that I taught when I was in school. So Joe Pike was the first teacher to come back that I had in school as a student. He was in one of my first years of teaching. He came back and was a 7th grade teacher to my 8th grade teacher. And when he left, Jennifer Richards, who teaches on a Carthage Elementary now, was a partner teacher with me. And shortly after that, I was lucky enough to have my daughter come back and teach with me. And she's been with me for 17 years now, and the two of us ran the junior high for a while, so there was no getting away with anything. When you have a Marguerite and a Marguerite, you're pretty much stuck with whatever you want to do. So I really think this transition I'm in now is probably my last transition. But again, I never say never, because that word seems to disappear quickly when you think things are going on. I've seen many generations of families come through the school. I've done second generations myself, so got a couple third coming up. So that's why I know it's probably time to do. I started at Augustinian with the idea that this would be my stepping stone. It would give me a place to start my career. And I was hooked that first year with those 29 little 4th graders I had. And so it was just a place that I stayed, because when I'm not with my family at home, I'm with my family at Augustinian. And I still love it after 41 years. So that's my story.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, I agreed to take a job at North Country Public Radio in 1980. I'd been in the North Country at that point for about 9 years. And I thought, radio, I didn't know how to thread a tape machine. I'd never been in front of a microphone. I thought, oh, radio. Yeah, that sounds like fun. I'll do that for a couple of years. So, you can do the math. I've been at the station since 1980. It's when you find your calling. Yeah, when you find it, right? So our next story will come from Ron. Is Ron here? Ron Campo? Did he make it? Oh, no. No? In that case, I see Jeff Cole has made it into the room. Jeff and Pam are going to come up and talk a little bit to us about their work. Yeah? Come on. Welcome, Jeff. Thanks for coming, Jeff.
Absolutely. Thank you. How are you? Hi, everybody. How are you?
He has a face for television.
So I guess, I don't know if I need the microphone or not. It's up to you guys if it sounds better. You're recording it. Okay, so hello to the recorder. So I guess the history that I guess I'm here to talk about would be a place called Brayman's Manufacturing, and I don't know how many people have heard of it or not. Many have. Okay, that's awesome. So Brayman's would be a company that started in our family when our ancestors, I say our, with my mom and I, would be my mom's side of the family, so back in 1907. And it was a guy with the last name Brayman, Orman Brayman, who left Brayman, Pennsylvania, I think at 18 years old. He was young. So he came to Carthage, and he wanted to start his own wood mill, his own operation. And the family had that history in Brayman, Pennsylvania as well, but he wanted to be out on his own. Now, the interesting question there is, how does a guy in Brayman, Pennsylvania find out about Carthage, New York? I mean, we're not, obviously in the day and age of cell phones, internet, and all that. You wonder how word traveled in terms of, okay, Carthage had opportunities. But he did come here in 1907, and he bought a plant over in West Carthage, Hubbard Street, and that was the MP Mason company, a woodmaker. And he bought that, and just recently I found, and I'll tell you about the history, but I have the paperwork of when MP Mason told his customers in 1907, it was January 1 of 08, I think is what it's marked, told his customers that he was relinquishing his company and that Mr. Brayman was taking over. Mr. Brayman had letterhead, and he sent out a note to all the customers and telling people that he was taking over the MP Mason company and renaming it Brayman's Manufacturing. And in fact, in some of the order books that we see here that I brought with me, that if you want to look at, I think quickly in 1908, Mr. Brayman made notes in there that he listed the companies in there that he was telling them of a price increase. And so he took over, but he knew how he had to make his money, apparently. But he made those notes in the books that I have from 1908. So in 1915, there was a fire, and unfortunately, Brayman's and fires go hand in hand. A wood mill, that kind of operation, sawdust and spontaneous combustion or drop of a cigarette or whatever. But the plant in West Carthage burned. And so in that process, Mr. Brayman needed a new place, and so he came over to Carthage on Alexandria Street. And that was where the Wilna Furniture Company was located. And so big, huge building, and I do have a picture of what the mill looked like, and if you want, you probably have seen it, but it was, I think, double the size that it was in that photo, or that it is in that photo. It was double the size. I think half of it at this point had burned already, in which there were two sides of it. So what you see there would be doubled on the other side, and there was a big atrium in the middle. It was really one of the classiest manufacturing buildings of its time. And I think someone else operated in the one side, as Mr. Brayman was on the side that he bought from the Wilna Furniture Company. And so that was operated through the years. Mr. Brayman ran the company for years until he died in the 30s. Mr. Stalker, which would be my mom's grandfather, then took over. And he ran it. My grandfather, Robert Place, he went away to war, came back after World War II, and became involved in the company. So it would have been his wife's family. Her family had the company, but Grandpa came back to be with the company, and then eventually was running the company until 1972, when I think Grandpa, a very wise person, saw the popularity of plastic and the emergence of China, and he sold the company to All American Brush, and they were out of New Jersey. And he stayed on to run the company for them, to manage it until the 1980s, I think 86, and then he retired. After that, it didn't bode well for wood manufacturers, and it went downhill. All American Brush ended up selling it to some other people, and it was back a local owner. But the hardships were just too great, and it did go into it went dark. For whatever reason, it went dark. So then from there, now Habitat for Humanity is building on the site. So my grandmother, Jean Place, she was vice president of the company, which I always point out is really, really cool, because I think in the time that she was, and she's still here in Carthage. She still is here at 95 years old. So she was vice president of the company, and I think in that era, in the years that she was doing that, there weren't many women that had that kind of a title, and I like to point that out. So now we'd always drive by, and Grandma would often say, "Boy, I wish they'd do something with that plant," because it just was abandoned for a long time. A final fire in 2005. Really kind of just gutted it, and that's when they demolished the old mill, and it was a vacant land. In 2007, I was president of Habitat for Humanity and the Thousand Islands chapter, and we started to make questions. We asked questions about it, because I was like, well, Habitat thrives off donations, and a donation of land would be a really big thing for Habitat. And we were building just across the street on Alexandria Street. So started to ask questions about it, but everybody was worried that, because no one really had ownership of it, it went in back taxes. No one really wanted to touch the land, because they all thought, old manufacturer, that it would be contaminated. And a lot of the places are, right? A lot of places that were paper makers would be contaminated. But Grandpa was alive then, and so as people were questioning the status of the environmental piece of the puzzle, I said, well, let me just ask the guy that ran the company for years. And so I asked him, and he was like, no, we never dumped anything. We never stored any oil drums underground. We did lacquering in the third floor, I think it was, and all, that sort of stuff. So there wasn't anything to indicate that there was any kind of environmental problems. So I moved that forward, got some help from local officials. New York State stepped in. They paid for the environmental study. It came back clean. We said, we told you so. They then took it off back taxes. They took ownership in Carthage. Carthage turned it over to Habitat, and now 4 homes are there. Going on 5, they'll build 5 down there, and reuse of that land. Homes back on the tax rolls, called Brayman's Block. So one thing I skipped over, I guess, is what Brayman's made. So Brayman's made blocks, brush blocks. And so when we started the Habitat project, it was fun, because we were renaming or rebuilding a block, right, a neighborhood block, and that's what Brayman's made. So it was fun to have that be Brayman's Block. And so, as Grandma would say, boy, I wish they'd do something with that, down there. Well, we have, and successfully, and it's turned out very, very well, I think, down there. But Brayman's made brush blocks, and so I did bring a couple of samples. So my grandfather, in it was 05-ish, when he sold the company to All American Brush, he knew probably how corporations work, and they wouldn't give a hoot about the files in the back room. They wouldn't give a hoot about the prototypes that our family made through the years, ancestors here in 1907, and he kept all that stuff. He was wise enough to say, this is family history. He kept boxes of it. So I always had an interest in it, in family history especially. Fourth grade, learning about Carthage and West Carthage with Mrs. Thornton. I was very, very intrigued in history, but definitely for family history, it was a big part of it, and I like to learn about that. I remember a little bit about the mill. Mom knows more. She can describe it a little bit better. When I was at the mill, I always tell the story. When I was at the mill, I would always be in Grandpa's office. The office was huge. It had a huge desk, but it was probably just because I was small. But huge wooden desk, and I always had to fill out an employment application. So he always had me filling out the employment application. So, of course, you had to print, you had to press hard, so it was carbon copy, and go through. So I look back now, and I laugh because I kind of think it was just to give me something to do to get out of his hair. As he was doing things at the plant, I was in the corner filling out my 15th job application or whatever it was. So I wish I had that. I wish he kept one of those. That would be fun. When Grandpa sold, he kept everything that he could, and so I can stand here today with brush blocks that the company made, and tags on them that are from 1935, and it has that was the tag, and I think the mailing label. I mean, essentially that's a shipping label that would send this to the company. It looks like something Hoffman and Company, and tagged on the bottom is Brayman's Manufacturing in Carthage. So this one, 1935, and so what Brayman's would make would be push brooms, and so they wouldn't put the bristles in the brooms, right? But they would outsource that. But this is what they made. This was the bread and butter, and so the handle as well they made, right? And they make the handles. And it would screw in, into here. It was threaded. And so what I have are boxes full of these. A lot of them are colored. And a lot of them are different shapes and colors and stuff. But so I have to imagine each one of these maybe with some sort of bristle, and then we guess what it would have cleaned. We're not sure exactly what everything was going to clean. This is from 1934. So Grandpa kept a lot of this stuff, and I should have brought the Swiffer. I forgot about that, but there's one. I think it was what is the Swiffer now? 2 blocks. Screwed together, but you could unscrew and you could put in some sort of cloth and then screw it back down. And I think it was the ancestor to the Swiffer. So you have to guess a little bit at some of the stuff. But I did, when Grandpa gave me this stuff, the one thing that I took, and it was in the piece, and I appreciate using the quote on the radio, is he sat there. It was really a great afternoon. He sat there and he would tell me how each piece was made. He'd be able to tell me what machine and what they had to do and how they had to make it. And I said to him, he had probably between 50 and 100 employees. And I would say, if you were running the company and you had employees, how do you know how to make all this stuff? How'd you have the time? Where'd you find the time to be able to make that stuff? Or to know how to do it. And he told me, it was a quote that I'll never forget, he told me, if you can't do something for yourself, how can you expect someone else to do it for you? So that's always kind of stayed with me, that you have to understand how things work, even if you don't have to do them and others can do it for you, but it's still very, very good for you probably to learn how to do stuff for yourself. And that's right down to the basics, I think, of life, right? So the other thing that Grandpa saved were orders, and I don't know if anything is in this that will fall out, but you can certainly take it, pass it around. But in this are orders, and I have 5 binders, all in plastic, that Grandpa alphabetized of all the company orders that were given to Brayman. So in there you'll see the different elaborate letterheads from different companies that would make orders to Brayman's, and they're, I think, it depends on which one you look at, but they're 20s, 30s, 40s. That's the era that these letters are from, 1932. I've done a couple of internet searches on a few of the companies to see if some are still around, and some are, and some are interested in the history. Others I haven't heard from. So one of the big customers was Rand McNally, a map company, right? So if you think back to our elementary school days and you think of the big maps that are on the wall and the ones that you would pull down similar to the machine behind us here, those wooden dowels Bremen's made. And so Rand McNally, the big map company, was one of the big customers. And so I do have, and I'm not sure if it's in that one or one of the other four, but they're alphabetized. So if you're in the M's, there is a Rand McNally that would be in there of them making an order to Bremen's. Bremen's never stamped anything, and so we don't know if what is Bremen's or what is not. But the other customer that used the dowels, wooden dowels, U.S. Department of Interior in D.C., and they ordered wooden dowels. I have that letter from the government, and it. Whether it's true or not, I will believe that somewhere in D.C. there's probably in a museum someplace, just because they probably needed the map roller, the dowel somewhere somehow to put something on. But in D.C., there's probably a really probably a historic map in some museum that's on a Bremen's dowel. Can't prove it because they never stamped anything, but I'll believe it just because you can, and I think there's a good chance at it. And other stuff that I brought along with me, just because, again, I have boxes of stuff that Grandpa, and I'm so grateful he did, but the original deeds when Mr. Mason sold to Mr. Bremen in 1907, and so I have those deeds. And not only did he, the other part of the history is cool, is where the it used to be Jubilee Grocery Store. Now it's the West Carthage Professional Building, where the hospital has a facility on Bridge Street in West Carthage. It used to be what was called the MP Mason House, the Mason Mansion. And in the transaction, that's where they ended up living. Bremen's lived in that house, and such an elaborate house. And I didn't bring a picture of the house, but I know that it's been circulated around town. But that was torn down to put the grocery store in. But that was another piece of history that is part of the collection that we have. What have I left out? Yeah, well, it's just because she can stand over there and not have to describe anything. Yeah. Well, any questions? I mean, I'm happy to answer. I wonder. I wonder if we don't have that opportunity, but yeah, I just think it's important. It's fun to have that history. I think it's important to remember it. I mean, we had James River, we had Crown Zellerbach, we had the big corporations, but it's important, I think, to remember for me, the history of family, but also the history of what helped build the region, the town. Wood manufacturing was great here because of the timber in the Adirondacks and the ability. So the mill had the ability to make the stuff, but it also had the lumber yard, the sawmill. So that would be impressive to see in the pictures. I see it, but to see it in real life, I mean, all the logs that would come in, and what it would be cut down and used for. I think it's important to remember that history. There aren't many of those, I think, that had that kind of family history. Starting something like that here in town. The Hershey's would be the other families that would definitely. Perfect, yeah. So that's who I always chat with John and Tyler about that. And we all graduated high school together. But so anyway, thank you very much. And more stuff to look at if you'd like to.